Happy New Year, my beautiful watchers. I suspect the last half-decade or so has taught us that expressing expectations of a brighter future is just tempting fate at this point, and it's better to sing about our hopes for damage control. But hey, we don't have to worry about that right now at least, because this video is more about looking back than forwards. For once in my life, I think I actually managed to read or reread a satisfying amount of books this year, so I thought I'd share my somewhat rambly thoughts about the best, worst, and the most offensively average. Please note that while these books are divided into somewhat damning categories, they are not ranked, so the order in which they appear does not denote superiority. If you're an avid watcher, you'll have heard me talk about everything on the bad list at some point in episodes past, but there are some on the positive and neutral sides of things that you'll be hearing about for the first time, as they never got their own episodes, either because I just read them for fun or because positive reviews don't tend to do as well on YouTube as negative. It is what it is. Starting off with the good, I managed to find the time to reread the entire Miles Vorkosigan saga by Lois McMaster Bujold. This was a childhood favourite series of mine that I revisited this year and was overjoyed to discover held up perfectly. It's a science fiction series that centres around a young man who is born with what is essentially dwarfism on a planet that's made being ableist a cornerstone part of its culture on every level. Said planet, Barrier, is kind of interesting because it started off as a mostly Russian colony but got cut off from the rest of galactic society for a few hundred years, during which it regressed back to medieval level technology, only to be rediscovered by humanity at large and immediately invaded. Miles is the son and grandson of the war heroes who saved the planet from being conquered, so he obviously has a ton of complexes regarding that. He inherited his forebears' military genius as well though, so he's desperate to prove himself to the universe, no matter how much the universe wishes to crush him. What's really fun about Miles is his greatest strength, his unstoppable nature, is also his greatest character flaw, as his refusal to slow down for even a second gets him into the most hilariously dangerous situations you can imagine that he then has to think his way out of. Flawed people make for the best protagonists in my opinion, and Miles really is the epitome of a lovable, difficult individual. Alas, he's too old for the role now, but when Game of Thrones first started coming out, I remember thinking that Peter Dinklage would have made an amazing Miles if they'd ever chosen to adapt it to film. There's so much more I could say about this character and this series as a whole that I just don't have time for now, but at some point I'm sure I'll follow through on my threat to do a Patreon exclusive ramble about all the things I love about them. But for now, up next on the positive reading experience list is the Hercule Poirot Mysteries by Dame Agatha Christie. Agatha Christie is not only the best-selling novelist of all time, she holds this title by a shockingly comfortable margin, having sold more books than the next two best-selling novelists combined. And it's weird that this fact, while not completely unknown, is not more common knowledge than it is. Disclaimer, for a ton of reasons I could be completely talking out of my arse here, but it seems to me that despite her dominance of this bestsellers list, Christie just doesn't get to enjoy the same sort of space in my generation's mind zones as other demonstrably less successful authors, and that's a weird mystery I may have to look into someday. But for now, I figured that this year I could at least correct the glaring Dame Agatha-sized hole in my literary experience and read as many of her early books as I could fit into my schedule, which ended up including The Mysterious Affair at Styles, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, Murder on the Orient Express, and Death on the Nile. In hindsight, this was rather stupid, but I think I was lulled into a false sense of security regarding how Dame Agatha can knock you the fuck out with plot twists, because the big reveal at the end of Murder on the Orient Express had become somewhat common knowledge long before I picked up the book. As a result, I really wasn't prepared for the stories I had no prior knowledge of, and how well she was going to misdirect me into smugly assuming I knew where something was going, only for her to pull the rug out from under me in ways that somehow always avoided feeling convoluted. I think part of the reason I haven't been super tempted to cover her work on the channel in the past is the sheer redundancy I feel crashing down upon me, being a book critic in the year of our Lord 2022, saying, hey guys, it turns out Agatha Christie was really good at writing crime mystery novels. I know, I'm blowing your minds here. It also turns out that Tolkien guy was pretty on the ball regarding modern fantasy. But yes, these books are really fucking good. If you like mysteries, crime thrillers, or British period dramas, they'll be really good for you. Next up, we are Legion, We Are Bob by Dennis E. Taylor. This book was a happy random find while I was looking over lists of award winners from the last decade. It's the first book in what would amusingly become known as as the Bobbyverse series. The general setup is an engineer and small company CEO called Bob signs up for the Walt Disney treatment, i.e. having his head frozen upon his death with the hopes of being revived at a future date, then is killed pretty much on the way home from signing the paperwork. Awakening a few centuries later, Bob finds himself basically a self-replicating AI shoved inside a deep space probe and, unfortunately, a slave to the evil theocracy that America has devolved into in the intervening years. He's tasked with well, I guess he doesn't really have hands, single-dronedly exploring the galaxy for potential colony planets to evacuate what's left of the Earth's population to before it becomes completely uninhabitable. It kind of reminded me of The Martian in that there's a lot of satisfying problem-solving throughout the book, and it's very interesting to see Bob's solution to things, as he is always an engineer first and everything else second, so his ways of dealing with diplomatic, military, or humanitarian issues are always slightly bizarre. I also found the way that Taylor dealt with the self-replication aspect of it really interesting. Every time Bob built a new probe and copied himself into it, there would be a not fully understood flaw in the replication process, so the resulting Bob is just ever so slightly different in personality, so by the end of the book you have this full cast of people who are essentially the same person, but also distinct in their own way. Taylor is also very obviously a massive nerd, so there's a lot of very fun references, like Bob programming his virtual assistant to look like Admiral Akbar. It might skirt the line for some people, but I don't personally think he reaches obnoxious levels like, say, Ready Player One, for example. Moving on, it's hard to say if I should classify Janissaries by Jeremy Pournelle as science fiction or medieval drama, because it's honestly kind of both. The general synopsis sounds a little silly out of context, so I hope you can trust me regarding it making a lot more sense in the book. Basically, a platoon of American soldiers who are just about to be killed in the Korean War get kidnapped by aliens who transport them to an Earth-like planet to oversee the growing of space drugs that for political reasons they can't get involved in themselves. This world is populated by dozens of societies that have evolved from the various groups that this has happened to in the past. Quite far in the past in some cases due to the time dilation effect of travelling faster than light. The result is a ton of interacting cultures that never overlapped back on Earth due to either time period or geography. So, lacking the numbers and equipment to single-handedly conquer the planet, the Americans have to form alliances with the pre-existing locals. In this first book you primarily see what is basically Celtic Highlanders going up against the legions of Byzantine-era Rome. Now that I say all this out loud, it does sound like someone just novelized Ultimate Epic Battle Simulator, but these stories have a strong personal element to them as well, I promise. Another random but fortunate find while I was scrolling through Kindle was Raven's Peace by Glenn Stewart. The concept for this science fiction jumped out to me right away because it's based on a very interesting question not often explored by epic space fantasies. What happens next? By that, I mean the story takes place immediately after the massive evil space empire of insectoid monsters is defeated, and the plucky alliance of rebel humans and aliens, once united in their fight for freedom, suddenly have to realize that they're now in a galaxy devoid of a unifying government, and several member races are ideologically opposed to each other in every other possible way. Spoilers, but they don't even make it through the first post-victory negotiations before they all turn on each other. As is the way of many space epics, the POV character is a starship captain, in this case a cruiser in the human military. It falls on his shoulders to try to keep the peace between all of the former rebel species and fight anyone who decides that maybe they should be the new empire now. Another interesting thing about this book is its politics. Now, usually when a novel is quite pro-military, even a fictional space military, there tends to be a somewhat conservative or at least very centralist undertone to it, but Raven's Peace is probably the most aggressively liberal book I've read in a long time. The main character is an openly bisexual, demisexual, middle-aged Asian American who is in therapy to deal with the PTSD from his tragic backstory because the Space Navy considers the mental health of its officers as important as their physical health. Unfortunately, the pacing of this book can be a little frustrating. An awful lot of nothing happens, and then the entire plot seems to all happen at once before returning to a whole lot of nothing happening again. This is a trait that does improve in later books in the series, but never disappears entirely. Before moving on, honorable good read mentions go to Iron Widow, Good Omens, The Martian, American Gods, and Fire and Blood. All great reads that I have already talked about at least twice, so I just don't have anything more more constructive to add right now. Now, a quick delve into the books that I experienced in 2022 that spectacularly failed to make a lasting impression on me, either positively or negatively. The Honor Harrington Collection by David Weber, a series of books about a space captain commanding various warships during a not very subtle allegory for the Peninsular War between Britain and France. This was another childhood favourite series of mine, and it was disappointing to come back to it and eventually discover it wasn't quite as exciting as I remembered. I think one of the biggest issues is the main character is so perfect, she actually starts to be kind of boring after a while. I also couldn't help but notice that the word chuckle was being used at least every other page, and it's become my new least favourite word in fiction. After a while, I could feel my brain start to melt and leak out of my nose and ears. The Beach by Alex Garland. I mean, it's fine in the grand scheme of things, it's just overwhelmingly unexceptional in its writing style, and the plot is a little thin when you get right down to it. Shoeless Joe by W.P. Kinsella. If you are obsessed with baseball or J.D. Salinger, it might be worth reading, but for everyone else, it is a complete snooze fest. Alive by Piers Paul Reed. This may seem a little unfair, but there is only so much excruciating detail about real-life cannibalism a person can read about before they start to feel really fucking sick. Arabella Grimsborough versus the Wonderful Wizard. I'm just not that into cynical humor, sorry. Vampire Academy by Rochelle Mead. I'm given to understand it gets better in later books, but this first entry into the series of the same name was pretty underwhelming by most metrics. And The Snowman by Joe Nesbo. If there is any upside to the utterly incompetent, incomprehensible mess that was the film adaptation of The Snowman, it has to be the way it makes the otherwise offensively mediocre book look better in comparison. If you just absolutely need a fix of Scandinavian murder mystery filled with bizarre sexual elements and you've already finished reading the Millennium series, then fine, go for it. Otherwise, there's just a lot better books out there. And finally, the worst books I was unlucky enough to be subjected to this year, starting with Twilight New Moon by Stephanie Meyer. Oh my gosh, a male YouTuber complaining about the Twilight Saga for the 57th time. Is it the early 2000s again already? Yeah, I know I'm not bringing anything new to the table here from a general standpoint or even from my own channel. As I've said before, Stephanie Meyer is a very average writer with occasional moments of surprising talent who puts those talents towards creating a series of books with incredibly unlikable characters, ultra-thin plots, and a lot of other inexplicable writing choices. New Moon might have gotten away with its greatest sin simply being that it is unbelievably boring had it not been our first introduction to the Native American werewolves, and Meyer's choice to include child grooming in their normal everyday behavior as the first steps down the slippery slope that led me to go from determination to give these books a fair chance to the most genuine pillow scream I've ever performed. That said, some things really do benefit from a sense of perspective, which I mentioned because this year I also read The Mister by E.L. James. No matter how frustrated I'll ever be with Stephanie Meyer, my heart will always go out to her regarding how shitty it must be for her to have to live with the fact that the fanfiction origins of 50 Shades of Grey will eternally associate her with E.L. James. And it really is a disservice to Meyer to mention her in the same breath as James. No matter what issues I have with her work, and there are many, Meyer possesses a basic level of competence that James is yet to display in any capacity. Between the charity fundraisers and the eventual review, I admittedly managed to subject myself to The Mister more than the average person, but I assure you, having had a few months space from it and time to think about it, my overwhelmingly negative opinion on every conceivable aspect of the writing, plot, characters, formatting, and foul mental aftertaste you get from reading it hasn't lessened one bit. Throw thyselves from the highest mountaintop rather than willingly read this book, my children. Moving laterally, writing talent-wise, we come to Ladies First by Liberty Adams. Ladies First, the strange, bizarre peephole into the warped personal reality the conservatively minded work so hard to build around themselves and then live in. Despite being on par with E.L. James' poor writing skills-wise, this book at least managed to be entertaining by how utterly, and more importantly, earnestly deranged it was. As right-wing propaganda goes, it's far too obvious and clumsy to be sinister or manipulative in the way that other works are, like the comedy trope about the enemy spy being so hilariously obvious that people enjoy having him around. It's still bad though, don't get me wrong, it's a terrible, terrible book, it's just fun to laugh at. BT dubs, while everyone's here, I would like to address a common comment left on the original review. Yes, I agree that the terminology used, in particular the habit of referring to women as females whenever possible, the other clear examples of misogyny, and the anomalous nature of the author do seem to imply that Liberty Adams might be the pen persona of a male writer, but I try to make it a personal rule to never question someone's stated gender, no matter who's involved or what the circumstances are. Even here involving someone who we all know would absolutely not respect anyone else's gender identity, it's just not a good precedent to set, you know? There are plenty of things to question regarding this book's ideology, but I can't see any evidence that the biography of the writer was made in bad faith, so let's just not go there, okay? So yeah, that was most of my 2022 literary experience. If you guys would like to share yours or have any recommendations for me now that you have a better idea of what I enjoy, please avail yourself of the comments below. Be sure to check out my Patreon page for additional Dom-related content. Not that kind of Dom, it's just my name, and bring it on, 2023. Much love and appreciation to my patrons of honor, Shelby Holtz, Quint, and April Mack. And a huge thank you to this video's editor, Sophia Ricciardi. Links to her work in the video description. I think I just got nail polish in my mouth. Sorry, nail polish remover, even worse. Devolved into in the intermeaning. Another good American gods, bad American gods, naughty American gods. I don't know where I'm going with this. Good read mentions go to Iron Widow, aggressively live up.